And we're recording. Watch what you say. Watch the eye rolls for those that are sharing the screen. Please, if you don't want to share your screen, great. We don't want to know where you are in the house, or if you're still getting dressed and ready for the day. So today this is Virtual Presentation Friday. So those of you that have never been on these, I'm the host with the most and the most colorfully dressed in providing these free 1-hour educational seminars to our professionals and healthcare senior living professionals as well. And we just try to put these together to stay connected, networking, educated, informed, and earning and gaining resources that we may have not heard about. And a lot of the topics are geared towards how we handle and cope with COVID and a pandemic and how to move forward from this and how we're learning from it. So these have been really beneficial and educational. And we've had some amazing speakers and more amazing speakers to come. And just a reminder, this next Friday is the last one for the rest of the year. So just keep that in mind. We'll start back up January 8th. I know it's sad, tears are falling, but I need a break and I'd like to have time with my family during the holidays, as you all should too. So today is one second to last of the presentation Fridays for this year. I've been so grateful and thankful for all of your support in participating in this. So thank you all for continuing and being supportive of this group. Today's exclusive sponsor, my hands right, is Innovage. Eric Beasley is a regional business development director, and his title might be even cooler and more prominent than that. But I'll let Eric, you take it away, sir.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Micah, for having me here. I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to test everyone's real commitment here. I know everyone's muted, but I want you to say out loud, I want you to say my Innovage. Say my Innovage.
Innovate.
There we go.
Wonderful. Innovage.
Now I want you to go to your website browser and type in myinnovage.com. That's our website where you can find all the information that you want about our company and about the PACE program. PACE is an acronym for Program of All-Inclusive Care for the Elderly. The mission of our organization is to help seniors stay independent as long as possible. And as many of you know, independence is very, it's the definition of independence is really independent to the person that you're talking to. And so when we're talking about all-inclusive care, the PACE program is the program that can really take the place or postpone placement for frail seniors. There are a lot of healthy seniors out there that can really benefit from CCC Plus programs, MCOs that are helping them out. But when a person is in a place where they would normally go to a nursing home, they would qualify for nursing home care, but they are committed to staying in the home. Those are the folks that the PACE program is for. And so if you're going to www.myinnovage.com, you can learn more about our program. But the piece that I really want to leave this group with about Innovage PACE is that what we normally find in the community when we're meeting people is we find folks that are making promises to their loved ones, to their parents, and they're making this promise that they are going to do whatever is in their power to make sure that they can stay in the place that's comfortable for them, make sure they can stay independent as long as possible, and make sure they can stay in their home. And oftentimes they're making that promise without a plan. And Innovage can be that plan for those folks who are committed to staying in the community for as long as possible. So when you go to www.myinnovage.com, you'll see all kinds of ways that you can connect with us, ways that you can, folks can pre-qualify for the program, and you can have someone from our organization reach back out to you to give you more information. So thank you again, Micah, for the opportunity to share today, and appreciate you being here as well, Dr. Welleford, and we look forward to the presentation.
Thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure having you on here, brother. You've been a big supporter for sure. So thank you for all that My Innovage does to the area and to our seniors and keeping them home as long as possible and being a support to them. Again, reminder, those of you that have just joined, if you have a group with you and you're not sharing your screen, please let me know who's watching with you so you can get the CEU credits. And those that are on the phone, please make sure you email me that you did attend today. So you can also get the email from me for the survey. Now, for the moment we have all been waiting for, Dr. Ayn Welleford is a great friend, mentor, person that I seek a lot of guidance from. She may not know that, but now she can start blushing if she ever does. But she has been a big fan of mine. I love all the things that she does in the community. Hashtag Disrupt Ageism was one of the things that I participated in, but she needs no further introduction. And without further ado, Dr. Ayn Welleford discussing compassion fatigue, building compassion satisfaction in our organizations and communities. Dr. Welleford.
So thank you so much, Micah. Yes, we have this mutual admiration society, Micah and I. Can everybody see my screen with my slides right now? Okay, great. So thank you, Micah, for the invitation. Thank you for this wonderful learning community, this learning space that you've created. And thanks, Eric, with InnovAge for your sponsorship. I've really been honored, not just today to be in this learning space, but I really enjoyed being with this, what I consider to be a compassionate community with you all on Fridays throughout the time that we've been able to do this here together. So thanks, Micah. I know the hard work that goes into making all of this happen. People may not know unless you do a lot of continuing education. This is a lot of work, and people don't do it for anything other than the love of it. So I just want to give a shout out to Micah for creating truly what I believe is a compassionate community. So for folks who may not know, I know some folks who are on here do know this because they participated in the larger series. We created a 5-week series about compassion fatigue this semester in the Department of Gerontology, and I have had the privilege of being in another learning community with people throughout that 5-week series. So what you're going to see today is, I promise I won't keep you for 5 weeks, that it's a briefer version of that presentation. And so I'm going to share at the end the link to the larger session if folks decide that they'd like to have more information about this topic. It is a favorite topic of mine, and it's particularly a favorite topic during COVID, which is one of the things, again, that Micah has mentioned. So I thought what we would just do is basically to give you some background about what we mean when we talk about compassion fatigue, because there are lots of doors that we can walk in through about this topic. And then we're going to jump right into how do we do something about that? How do we build compassion satisfaction in our organizations and in our communities? And I'm going to focus that part on some work that I enjoy in my own co-learning environment with Jay White and Gigi Amato. So some of this is research that I've done, and some of this is research that I'm going to be sharing from some of my colleagues. And then I'd like to jump to some opportunities for you all to share, either, as Micah says, by raising your hands or and unmuting yourselves, or in the chat box. So we'll have opportunities for that. So I do want to kind of move through this quickly and then get to your comments. So again, here are the folks that I give great joy and praise to in my learning environment, Gigi Amato and Jay White. You're going to hear more about them later, and I hope that if you are interested in learning more about some of their pieces of this presentation, that you'll reach out to them individually. So let's just jump into some background about compassion fatigues, because before we talk about how we build compassion satisfaction, we need to have some background in what it is we're really talking about. So compassion fatigue is a phrase that was originally used by Joynson in 1992, and I think it's important to recognize her name because most of the work about compassion fatigue is contributed to Charles Figley. But she was actually the original person who mentioned and started talking about compassion fatigue when she described an experience that nurses were having about being worn down by their daily emergencies that they were experiencing. So you can see there are lots of different definitions of compassion fatigue. So I'm not here to tell you what definition to choose, but I'm going to tell you which one I choose, and then, you take it or leave it and, choose for yourself. But I like this one up in the right-hand corner that's kind of a mashup. It's, states that it's a state of exhaustion dependent on a caring relationship where we have decreased coping ability, and it's characterized by a gradual decrease in compassion over time. That to me seems to encapsulate a lot of the things that we're talking about this experience of compassion fatigue. Recognizing again, there are lots of doors we can walk in through. Here are some other terms that I think it's important to recognize, because oftentimes people use the words burnout, secondary traumatic stress, caregiver burden, compassion fatigue. People use those synonymously, but if you really dig into the literature, you find that they are not at all synonymous. In fact, what we find is that burnout and secondary traumatic stress are actually pathways or precursors to this concept of compassion fatigue, and they're very different from each other. And I want you to think about this for yourself right now, because I think we're all kind of, in this experience of fatigue, whatever type of fatigue that is for you. And maybe the things that feel like they're burdening you, or maybe the people who are on your team that you work with on a regular basis. So in terms of these two precursors, burnout is more of a resource issue, that you feel like you are attempting to be, goal-directed, and there's something that's standing in your way. It's really a resource issue, an infrastructure issue, that you are experiencing a resource shortage, that you're not able to meet the goals that you are intending to meet. Okay, so when they say that it is an assertiveness goal achievement response, what that means is that you are trying to be active in your goal direction and you're unable to meet your goals. That's very different from the experience of secondary traumatic stress. Secondary traumatic stress is the experience of you are traveling alongside a person who is experiencing stress or trauma, and you have become a container for that person's, or possibly many people's, stress or trauma. Okay, so one is more of an external goal direction, your goals are being thwarted, and the other is you are becoming full up with the stress and trauma from other people. Those are very different pathways, and those are two ways. Of course, you could experience those simultaneously, but these are two ways that individuals can experience or move towards the end result of compassion fatigue. So again, thinking about the entire picture here, we're going to be focusing today on how we build compassion satisfaction. I think it would be unethical practice for me as a gerontologist not to be able to say, okay, what are we going to do about this? So I want us to be thinking equally, not just about compassion fatigue, but also about compassion satisfaction, because they are two sides of the same coin. One is the positive consequence of care, and one is the negative consequence of care. Compassion satisfaction is basically your big why, right? Compassion satisfaction is your joy, purpose, and meaning that you experience from your work. And for a lot of us, it's the reason that we came into the work we do. Right? I see people smiling. You know that this is what brought you here. Yeah, it's what at the end of the day you think, wow, that was a lot of work putting on those, virtual Friday presentations, Micah, but this brings me a lot of joy. This is my big why, bringing people to connect together, connecting people. And so, this whole thing about, I like to think about harmonizing compassion satisfaction and compassion fatigue. Because it's not that we're going to actually get rid of this notion of fatigue. That would be unrealistic. Fatigue is real. We'd like to harmonize, because I also don't actually believe in the idea of balance. But that's a conversation for another day. And we're going to talk about how resilience is a big piece of that, because we're working towards what are we going to do about this. Okay, so we could say, of course, that everyone is at risk for compassion fatigue. And that's true, right? There's reality to that. Absolutely. However, we're going to talk about what truly risk looks like, because there are some individuals and some contexts and some organizations that put us additionally at risk for compassion fatigue. And some of these are about an individual's history, and some of them are about the experiences that we bring with us to our current work life and personal life. And and some of them are personality factors that, frankly, we're, born with, and they're continued in our phenotypic expression of our genotype. So, if you're an individual, or individuals who are overly conscientious and perfectionistic and self-giving, and possibly in an environment with low social support, or maybe an individual or high stress in your personal life, or a history of trauma, or a self-experience or sense of isolation, these are individuals who are at heightened risk for compassion fatigue. And in my mind, we want to be super aware of that for ourselves and for people around us. So I think that it's important, even though we're going to talk about the organization, we are people who make up organizations. So we need to think about the entire picture here. So similarly, if we think about our professional and our work roles, there are things in those experiences that create additional risk. So if an individual in their work life says, I don't have any off switch, my work is constant, there's not a place to kind of set this aside. Or if an individual feels like their professional role is their identity, their whole identity. So, you have this identity pie that should be encapsulating all of your own identities, which there hopefully are many. But we know people, maybe we are those people, who your identity is largely your work. That puts a person at risk for compassion fatigue, right? Because there's not a lot of harmonization among those pieces of the pie. We're coming up on Thanksgiving. I really prefer sweet potato pie to pumpkin pie, just in case anybody wants to know this information about me. But I also like to have lots of pieces in the pie. That's essential for healthy identity development. It's also healthy in terms of reducing your risk for compassion fatigue from a work role, professional role standpoint. And then here are the examples of what promotes compassion fatigue or results in compassion fatigue from an organizational or environmental risk standpoint. And I think you can see how these could be amplified. Individuals who have high conscientiousness and high perfectionism are likely to choose places where they feel like they can make a difference, right? Because it's that kind of approach. And so sometimes we find ourselves, and I do say we, in terms of teach what you need to learn, write what you need to read standpoint, where you're in an environment where you're working really hard and striving to make a difference in people's lives. And sometimes those are lives where you may see low therapeutic success, where you're working with experiences that are particularly challenging, or you're working with individuals who experience a high level of stress and trauma. You may also be in an environment where there's a culture of silence, where we don't talk about, right, a lot of things. We don't talk about our own feelings in those experiences, and maybe we don't share a lot of the experiences that are going on for other people emotionally. Or where there's not a lot of training or infrastructure around issues of stress management, right? How do we address issues of compassion fatigue? And then amplifying that mindset of this work is my identity. If you're in a culture where we are our jobs, right, where we self-identify very strongly with those roles, then that will amplify that experience. And then, of course, demand of administrative duties on top of our care I saw that face. On top of those administrative duties. Okay, so, all right, so this is a model by Nolte, where they conducted a metasynthesis, which is basically a review of all the research that's been done about compassion fatigue. This is particularly for nurses, and which is largely where a lot of the research about compassion fatigue has been done. And this has been really driven, you know, kind of been a guidepost for a lot of the research that I've done, you know, work in this area and thinking about how do we address this in general, of course, but certainly right now with this experience of COVID, because, you know, as Micah mentioned, you know, this has amplified a lot of the experiences that we're having. And so in this metasynthesis, Nolte points out physical symptoms and emotional symptoms. We're going to be focusing mostly on the triggering factors, which are largely environmental, things that come from the outside of us, and then also measures to overcome and prevent. And Nolte phrases the measures to overcome and prevent based on who has my back, right? Who is supporting me in this experience of this fatigue, you know, that's in my life, whether that's personally, professionally, or organizationally. So you're going to see kind of Nolte revisited. Okay, so, you know, when Nolte talks about these triggering factors, she's really talking about, you know, how people expressed this, because this is a narrative expression of what people said about their compassion fatigue. And so it's in their own words, which I think it's very important to stay close to people's stories about the personal experiences that they're having. And you'll find that in compassion fatigue, that there's a lot of narrative representation of the work. So for people to say, this is an unbearable weight on my shoulders, or that I feel alone in a crowd, part of that is about, you know, infrastructure and support. And part of that is also about this sense of belongingness. So when we talk about moving into how do we create compassionate communities, those are two of the key components that we're going to talk about. So you see here when Nolte, you know, synthesized these points of what seem to be triggering factors. Part of them are infrastructure things about staff shortage, about support, about low transparency. She didn't call it low transparency, but I call that low transparency, you know, lack of understanding regarding the work environment. Work stress and unable to escape, you know, a person being overly involved or feeling overwhelmed. So I feel like we can see that this is a pattern, right? This is not like, you know, things are all over the place. I think we're seeing how the synthesis is, you know, coalescing together. And then of course, you know, enter COVID. All right, so, you know, every year the American Psychological Association does an annual stress survey in America. And so this actually is kind of intermittent, that they did a midway survey about specifically related to COVID. And I think it's very interesting because in 2019, the APA study indicated that not only was the evaluation of stress up for individuals, but the symptomatic, how do I say that? Subsequent symptomatic representation of stress, how people felt stress in their lives, was also increasing. And so then because of COVID, we're seeing an even greater increase. So people are experiencing increased stress. And, you know, I don't need to tell you all, stress kills. Ta-da. That's not news to anybody in this room. And then actually this is research. Again, I said you were going to hear more from Jay White and Gigi Amato. This is some information that Jay White shared in our previous presentation in terms of how COVID is affecting team performance, and then the risk factors or risk points for teams as they have been experienced. And again, I think you'll see another echoing or amplifying or exacerbation in terms of things like, you know, loss of collective efficacy and increased focus on self and narrowing attention to, you know, focus on self, which speaks again to that feeling of overwhelm. And then this notion of insufficient shared mental models, you know, what the priorities are and what the goals, and how do we really manage that if we don't have a shared sense of what the understanding is? And then, you know, this idea of psychological safety, when people have a discomfort with speaking up, that speaks to lack of trust, that speaks to lack of inclusivity, that speaks to, you know, lack of shared understanding and this collective nature of being able to work together in terms of belongingness. Schisms, you know, fault lines, that we feel separation in that work, hypervigilance. So again, these are all things, lack of team resilience, that we don't feel like we can come together as a team to make real differences. So again, the things that we know about compassion fatigue in the literature are truly being exacerbated by this experience of COVID. Okay, so if we don't already know why we care, okay, I have to have a slide about, why this matters. What is the big deal? Why would I say, I'm going to spend 5 weeks on compassion fatigue, and then I'm going to find every opportunity and welcome every opportunity to talk about this? So clearly there are personal and then subsequent interpersonal impacts of compassion fatigue. And there are upstream mental health effects. And upstream mental health effects means, you have this experience in your life that is a stressor, but gone untended can become a mental health disorder like depression or anxiety. Okay, and so that's not just impactful personally and interpersonally, it's also impactful from a cost standpoint, right, from mental health cost. And then from a workplace standpoint, we have organizational increased costs due to absenteeism, injury, and then of course, poor quality care and safety. Okay, so just as the risk factors for compassion fatigue are multidimensional, the ways that they represent themselves are, the ways that compassion fatigue represents itself is also multidimensional. And as you'll see, the ways that we have to address them are multidimensional. Okay, so I mentioned, I think that even though Joinson was the first person to coin or, mention this topic of compassion fatigue, Figley is the person who you see his name mostly in the literature. And so, this notion of, the most insidious aspect of compassion fatigue is that it attacks the very core of what brings helpers into this work, their empathy and compassion for others. Okay, so as a gerontologist, I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the importance of meaning making in people's lives. And this is about meaning making. If I can't connect to my big why, then that is going to impact my longevity because I am unable to live out my purpose. Right? So that's not something that's historically been recognized or spoken about in the compassion fatigue literature, but it's a, it's a specific infusion of a gerontological lens, I guess I would say. So again, to layer on that additional piece of the essential nature of meaning making, I think is something that we want to pay very close attention to as professionals and for ourselves as individuals. So as we're thinking about, again, back to Nolte's model about who has my back, you see these components that we've seen echoed repeatedly: support, professional development opportunities, ability to separate ourselves and set professional boundaries, opportunities for debriefing. Now, I would call that storytelling. Okay, let me just lay out what my own lens is here. I would call debriefing an opportunity for story. Mentoring, right? That's also about story, and it's also about building your own resilience and self-efficacy through sharing story with other people. Strong leadership in the organization. That's also an infrastructure issue as well as a resource issue. And then Nolte calls this self-care strategies. I'm not a fan of that phrase self-care. I prefer self-honoring practices. Again, a conversation for another day. And then a second meta-synthesis, this one was conducted by Cocker and Joss, that similarly shares things about, particularly about one program of training, this accelerated program for compassion fatigue, that identifies some specific components of, how do we build compassion satisfaction, or how do we reduce compassion fatigue? Again, sharing stories through debriefing, building self-compassion in order specifically to challenge that negative internal dialogue, which can be so damaging, and shifting from these negative automatic thoughts to a more positive outlook. And then building resiliency skills. Because, you know, this skill thing, resiliency skills and resources, that's both internal and external bubble wrap. And that's an important thing to think about, because sometimes, you know, when we are not operating from our best selves, we cannot rely on our own individual coping, right? We'd like to think that we can, like we can pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, but in reality, that's not a thing, right? We need to be really, you know, focused on working together and what we can do for ourselves and what we can learn and connect from other people. Okay, so, you know, Cocker and Joss go on to say, well, what are these resiliency skills? Again, they use that awful word, self-care, revitalization, connection and support, intentionality, self-regulation, perceptual maturation. Okay, we're going to talk about all of these things. So if you're going, what in the world is all that? Don't worry, we'll get to that. So this is what they mean in terms of resiliency skills. But then in their description, they get way down here, and then they say this one little sentence, right? This one little sentence, a supportive aftercare plan in collaboration with the employer or supervisor. And I thought, what in the world is that? Because they just had this one little sentence about it. I'm like, well, I want to know what that one looks like. I mean, I got all these other things. I'm a psychologist. I get it. I know what those terms are. I know what we're supposed to do there. But what do we really mean when we're talking about supportive aftercare? Okay, so, you know, in this coalescing and synthesis of the synthesis, you know, the things that occur to me is that what we want to build in terms of creating or building these compassion, satisfaction in our organizations and communities, it really boils down to these four things: confidence, competence, connectedness, and climate of compassion. Can you see how much I love alliteration? It helps me to remember stuff. If I can say this is the 4 C's. And so through the things that we have identified already in the literature, and as we're going to talk about how, right? How. What in the world does this look like? How do we do this? So building confidence through self and collective efficacy, and competence through self and team resilience, connectedness through mutual respect and trust, and a climate of compassion through inclusivity, open dialogue, and transparency. Now, as you hear these things, you should some bells should ring for you, and you should go, oh yeah, those are some of the things that we see as missing. And these are some things that we need to build. Mike, I see you taking pictures over there. Because really the goal is, you know, we're harmonizing compassion fatigue and compassion satisfaction. When the picture looks like this, there's no way that you can balance that. There's too much on the compassion fatigue side for your big why, your compassion satisfaction, the joy you have in your work, to be able to balance that out. So, you know, my lens is appreciative inquiry, and appreciative inquiry is grounded in a growth mindset about strengthening our strengths and looking for resources and resilience, growth mindset, and belonging. We need to be able to equalize or harmonize this balance. All right, so what does that look like? I would like, this is like my dream here, my compassion satisfaction dream, that we would take this traditional path that goes from compassion satisfaction, that we all come into this work because we have joy and meaning and purpose. And then we experience risks and triggers and burnout and secondary traumatic stress. And then we end up in this place of compassion fatigue that results in, you know, negative personal, interpersonal, professional consequences, results in high cost to our organizations, and results in a mental health crisis, which I would argue, diseases of despair on the rise, that is a mental health crisis. I would like to change this pathway to something that looks more like this, that you enter the workforce, you know, as I have these goals, I have this mission, I have this joy. Yes, there are risks and triggers along the way, but throughout I am reminded for myself, I remind people on my team, we have this co-learning environment, we have wisdom communities, and we have compassionate opportunities where we can maintain our compassion satisfaction throughout the entire experience. Not to say we're going to eliminate compassion fatigue, but that we have more of a harmonization of those two. Okay, so what does that look like? So I mentioned earlier that you were going to hear more, from the work of Jay White and things that he has shared with me. And one of these things is, as I'm looking at, the synthesis of the synthesis down to these 4 C's, the foundation of this seems to be this notion of trust. And we can build mutual respect and we can build trust with each other at every opportunity for an interaction. Every time we have an experience with another person, we have the opportunity to build trust. And one of the things that we find is that individuals better relate to conversations where they feel respected and valued. And, sadly, in our fast-paced environment, it's sometimes easy to forget this notion of intentional listening and attentive listening. But poor communication not only wastes time, it's also an opportunity, sadly, to break our trust. So I suspect many of you are familiar with the book 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And, while those components are, tried and true, right? We buy into that. My colleague Jay White reframes this to a theme of 5 functions of a team. And you see the foundation of these functions is trust. And this gain-framed messaging is an element of my lens of an appreciative mindset and positive thinking, which we accept as the backbone of team building and leadership. And the leadership literature suggests that people are more attracted to messaging that shows success, that shows resilience, and that shows positivity, rather than more of a loss frame or negative message. So again, important things about combating that negative messaging that people carry around in their internal dialogue and changing that to another form, more of a positive messaging. So what does this look like? So let me just share with you some of the things that I've learned from my colleague Jay about what building trust looks like. So a climate of trust is demonstrated through open dialogue. Again, thinking back to the things that we know break down trust and create compassion fatigue. Open dialogue and transparency and shared understanding of mission, purpose, and goals, right? Having all that stuff out in the open and having open dialogue about that. Creating that shared mission and defined purpose together, in addition to individual roles, recognizing what the individual roles, having a shared understanding of those, can promote this notion of collective self-efficacy, transparency, and open dialogue. If we don't have the opportunity to clarify those goals, that is a direct, attack on our compassion satisfaction. But building that promotes confidence in our work when we know what our roles are. So all the ways that we promote satisfaction and obviously disrupt the notion of compassion fatigue. So, next that I think is such another important component that Jay brings out in his work is the importance of demonstrating gratitude. And sometimes in our fast-paced environment, it's easy to forget about this very important, simple signal to a person that they have been heard, right? To say thank you, to use people's names. My mother always says that the sweetest sound to anyone's ears is the sound of their own name. And that's a real clear recognition to an individual that they are seen and they are heard. In addition, as you see in this slide, to ask questions for clarification and also to flesh out the story. And this demonstrates both attentive and reflective listening. And this is how we will build collective self-efficacy through shared goal setting and problem solving. Again, this is part of the narrative. So our collective self-efficacy, our team resilience, and our mutual respect are all built through shared mission, vision, and shared responsibility. both in times of success as well as times of struggle, right? Where we see the heroes, where we are sharing in times of struggle. And I think we would all agree that, you know, we're in a time of struggle where it would be important for us to, you know, experience some of that sharing. So again, you know, one of my favorite things that Jay says is that y'all means all, and establishing a sense of connection and belongingness requires being inclusive of all members of the team. And we'll talk more about this as we move into this narrative approach, but the importance of honoring the stories, particularly of stories that have not been honored, of people who feel that they have not been heard, elevating those voices. So trust is an essential element to team productivity, and without it, you're unlikely to really be able to get anything meaningful done for very long. And as leaders, it's important for us to set the example. And, you know, as we see from this quote here from David Cooperrider, you know, we all have the opportunity to be leaders. You know, we just have to be willing to say, I want to make a change here. Okay, so that's kind of the idea of trust. And then I want to, you know, move pretty quickly into this next session where we're going to flesh out the what and the why of building compassion satisfaction into layering on more of the how of what this looks like by talking about narrative care and wisdom environments. And you know what that looks like in terms of narrative practice. Narrative practice is really the practice of story. From narrative standpoint, we are all stories, right? We all are experts in this notion because, you know, we share stories all the time. And this is how we show interest and demonstrate that we care about people who are in our lives by close listening. And while we're close listening to the stories of another person, we are also close listening to ourselves, and we build not only that compassion that we've talked about, but also we build our own resources through these practices of, while we're listening, we're attending to places where we're maybe feeling trauma, where we're feeling triggered, where we're feeling reactions, and we have the opportunity to practice some self-regulation and this perceptual maturation that comes along with that, without being in the situation or the position of being reactive. The narrative practice in teams gives us the opportunity not just to build self, but also self-efficacy, but also collective efficacy and resilience, mutual respect and trust, while we're being open to these new ways of telling the stories, because we're practicing that together. So it moves from, this is the fact-based, to we have this opportunity to think about the possibility of our future together, our future teamwork together. So being with and restoring and meaning making, where stories have been silenced, where people do not feel heard, that's how we will be able to be inclusive and create a climate of compassion. Because from the narrative standpoint, we are all biographical beings, just like we are biopsychosocial spiritual beings. We are all stories. So these are some of the skills that are practiced through narrative approaches. And again, I encourage you to reach out to Gigi Amato if you would like to learn more about this practice of narrative gerontology or narrative practice, because, you know, this is deep and rich and powerful in the practice of narrative care. But at this point, you know, taking this a step further, right, to think about the creation of wisdom environments, which is kind of step beyond, you know, what narrative practice aims to do. You know, wisdom environments provide ample opportunities to discover our own wisdom through sharing, through reading the experiences that we're having with other people. I don't necessarily mean reading on paper. I mean reading the experience between us and other people, and reflecting on our own and other stories. And in wisdom environments, we see a lot of sharing and listening and contemplation and respect and open dialogue. All of these things that we've talked about are needed in terms of building compassion, satisfaction. And also inclusivity and a sense that all voices are welcome. And most importantly, we see trust. That is the foundation of all of this. So if we're circling back to our 4 C's, our synthesis of our synthesis, the learning environments, and actually very much, I have to say, you know, what has been created here in these Friday presentations, I think this is a wisdom environment, you know, because it possesses all 4 of these main components, that people feel a strong sense of collective self-efficacy, that there's a big sense of growing individual confidence and competence and team competence and resilience, connecting through mutual respect and trust, and the notion that all voices are welcome in terms of a climate of compassion. So this is an example from my standpoint, from my perspective, of an opportunity to create and build a compassionate community. So I applaud you, Micah, for making that happen for all of us. And I'm grateful that I've had the opportunity to participate in so many weeks throughout these so many months, and possibly so many months to continue. So, you know, remember thinking back to, you know, our current path, that, you know, our compassion fatigue oftentimes outweighs our compassion satisfaction. And our goal is more of an equalizing, more of a harmonizing of those experiences, so we can move from this traditional path of compassion satisfaction to compassion fatigue to a new path that's restored, where we have the opportunity to maintain our compassion satisfaction personally, in the work that we do, and within our organizations. So as we're wrapping up here, you know, and I just want to leave you with this question that, you know, if we have a few minutes to talk about it, I'd love to hear, or of course you can follow up with me afterwards. I want you to think about for yourselves, you know, what is it that you're already doing? Yeah, that you could continue in terms of building compassionate communities, right? What is it you're already doing? Because we want to strengthen our strengths. We want to be in that place of a growth mindset. And building on those strengths, what might you want to start? Say, oh yeah, I do this sort of, but I could really jump into this. And what is it that maybe you've thought about probably previously? I don't believe that we actually teach things to people that they don't already know, right? So I may have said some things that you go, oh yeah, that totally connects with me, but you already knew it. You just need somebody to kind of shine a light on it a little bit. So, you know, what might there be something that you say, oh yeah, I could kind of dial back on that. So I want to leave you with this kind of framework in terms of your stop, start, and continue. In thinking about how we're going to restore our own path of compassion satisfaction. So again, I mentioned that we did this as a 5-week session, and I think I'll share this in the chat so people can have the actual link to it and connect. So this is the link to the 5-week session. It's broken up into 5 weeks. The slides are all there. The recording is all there. You have the opportunity to participate and get certificates of completion. And then also, you know, our February conference is already underway in our planning. So I'd encourage people to mark their calendar for that, because there'll be more of these types of topics. And again, I'll share this with folks. So again, I just want to say thank you again to Micah for this opportunity, and to all of you who, not just for being here today, but for being part of this compassionate community throughout all of these months. And then of course to my co-learning team, Jay White and Gigi Amato, you know, for this opportunity to think about how do we really focus on building compassion satisfaction at the individual level, at the level of our work, whatever that means to each person, and then of course in our organizations. So this is how you find us if you need us. So at this point I'll say, Micah, you say whatever you want to say now. I'm
No,
done.
this has been amazing. I mean, we all feel we need this information and need another, boost of understanding, compassion, satisfaction, and how we can be better in our workplaces. Because, yes, Iris, yes. For those that are muted, sign language clapping. If you can see me, if I can stop moving, my screen kind of disappears me. But this is good information, and I think and what you gave, your presentation was spot on, and it's good to know that you're doing a 5-week session on this. For those of you, if you can chat it in the chat, and then for those of you, don't worry about typing it up. I'll send it out in my email this afternoon with my normal email information. You'll have Dr. Ann's information on there as well to contact her individually, as well as finding out more on how you can get more involved with VCU's program, but also compassion satisfaction, because we all need that. This has been a trying time, and I'm speaking to the choir, to all of you. This has just been a challenging time. I'm surprised on how quiet the chat has been, honestly. I guess everybody was just so intrigued and did not want to take their eyes off or think about typing. So with that, I would like to open up the floor to questions, or the screen, rather, the screens to questions. So if you are not sharing your screen, if you could raise your hand, or if you are sharing your screen, raise your hand or become unmuted and ask a question. I'm going to try to scroll through the screens here and see if anybody is coming off mute to ask a question. You do have, and you're the expert in this field on, so please dive into a question. Just looking. Really, nobody has a question? It's upsetting. Come on, everybody. None whatsoever?
I know.
So,
Well, and
Ann,
Micah,
with
I
your
did just.
compassion, go ahead.
Mhm. No, I was just saying I did just share the link to how you find the series if people want to do that.
So, and for others that may not be in this state or even in United States, what's the best way that they can maybe connect with you or take this initiative to their area? What are some things that they could be looking at to move forward with this program?
Well, so you can always connect with me by email if you want to talk to me directly. However, I think the biggest thing that I would like for people to take away from this conversation is recognizing for themselves and for people around them what the signs of compassion fatigue look like, and then how to reframe that in some ways. Now, I don't think that it's really realistic to expect that we're going to do all of the things, right? But some of the things are going to be more natural to you than others. So number one, recognizing the signs of compassion fatigue, physiological experiences or emotional experiences that people are having that look like decreased compassion, that look like, overwhelm, knowing what those look like for other people, and then reaching out in ways that are caring. So expressing gratitude for the work that people are doing, I think, is like job one. Walking in the door with gratitude and thanking people directly for what they're doing, I think, is really essential. And then not just asking people, are you okay? Because pretty much the answer is no. Let's just assume, right? Let's just assume nobody's okay. And not saying, hey, let me know if I can do something for you. I mean, I've kind of decided that's pretty much a microaggression. If you say to somebody, let me know, because, then that's putting one more thing on their to-do list. But if you can say, what could I do best to support you right now in this moment? And if you ask that question enough, eventually people will come up with something, right? Also, it's better to do something than to do nothing. It's better to do something even if it's the wrong thing than to sit around and wait for somebody to ask you for help. Because if you see the signs of struggle, they need something, right? We all need something, but it's different for all people. Now, for those of us who I feel like may have an experience of compassion fatigue, and I know, I just said don't add anything to your list. However, it's important to think about what might help you.
Yeah.
Okay, this may be too much information, but I had a therapist ask me one time, well, so what would feel good? And I couldn't come up with anything. And she said, that's where we'll start. So if you're in a
Wow.
place where you can't think of anything that would feel like something that would be a boost, well, then you really need to email me.
Yeah.
And we'll have a big old chat about that, because, you know, that's what I mean by we're not all operating from our best place.
Yeah.
And it's hard to come up with what would be helpful. And that's why I have challenge with that language called self-care. I think it's blaming, I think it's shaming, and I think it promotes anger to tell a person to say, I hope you're taking care of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Because if a person could take care of themselves, of course they would do that. But when we're not operating from our best selves, we may not be able to do that. And so that language can be damaging.
So
I hope that
real quick,
answered the question.
Susan, I'll come to you in just a minute. Eric, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I actually want to ask Dr. Welleford to, and you may not be able to get to it right offhand, but you mentioned without connecting to your big why, you cannot, can you finish that statement?
Oh, if you can't connect to your big why, then you're impacting your own longevity because you are not
Impacting your own
connected to
longevity.
your own sense of purpose.
Mm.
So, yeah,
That's deep.
that's
Right.
and that's yeah, right. I mean, so again, as a gerontologist, you know, as we move through our midlife is about generativity, right? Your midlife, and midlife is, you know, I hate to put numbers on it, but you know, whenever you think the middle of your life is, I plan to be 100. So, you know, middle of my life is like now, I'm 52, right? So I'm in midlife. Okay. So generativity is when you identify, you know, what your purpose is. So a person may look very successful, but if they're successful in things that somebody else thought that they were supposed to do, then that's not their purpose, right? Or from that burnout standpoint, if you feel like you're thwarted from connecting to your purpose, then you're going to have challenges being productive, generative, passing on your legacy, basically is what generativity is about, passing on your legacy. And then when you move into the next stage of integrity, did the things that I did and the stories of my life, did they all fit together and make sense? Then you're not going to be able to tell a cohesive story about your life. So that's what I mean by if you can't connect to your big why, if your big why is thwarted, then that's going to interfere with your sense of accomplishing, whatever accomplishing, success, those are words that you can't, just like you said, Eric, about your own innovage is so individually determined. The same is about purpose. We can't look at a person and say that they're meeting their purpose because we may not know, right?
True.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Susan.
Anne, thank you again.
Hi, Susan.
Hey, darling, I did have 2 sips of coffee this morning. But I've heard this before, and every time I hear Anne speak on this, I learn something new. And I recently had a loss in my life, and one of the questions I get asked all the time in cards and emails, and I know people mean well, is what, you know, if you need support, just let me know, or what can I do for you right now? And I know that they're coming from a place of heart, so I take it like that. But it is, to me, one more sort of task that now I almost feel like I've got to give back and take care of you for a minute on, you know, because you're trying to be helpful. But two things. One is make a list of things you need, and they don't have to be a casserole. Months and months ago, I had a problem, and Anne said, what can I do for you? And she came over and trimmed my hedges. I really needed that. When I looked out the back window, I could see this hedge gone wild, and she came over and trimmed it. And it was enormous for me to have that done, because I knew I couldn't bring myself to do it. But other things, and the other thing that has occurred to me is I tell people right now, I don't really need anything because life is pretty busy, but get in touch with me in about a month because that's when it's going to get quiet for me. And I'll get in touch with me in a month and offer to go for a walk or come sit outside in the middle of December or January. And I realize this is more personally than sort of what your compassion fatigue addresses, which is more folks who work in compassionate professions, but it's the same kind of thing, is that to suggest to either your coworkers or your clients, make a list of what you need, because when the person asks you at that moment, you're not going to remember. And you're not going to want one more casserole. Please, God, do not send me any more food. But, you know, make a list. You know, I need some eggs and milk. I need somebody to go take my trash out. Just things like that. So thank you, Ann. I always enjoy listening to you.
Well, thank you, Susan. I appreciate that. And I do think that compassion fatigue isn't just a concept for professionals. I think what you've said is right on. It's right on. It's for all of us, right? We are all human beings within that realm. So thank you, Susan.
And then there was a comment that was, how can we be a catalyst to remind folks of their purpose, discover their purpose, which seems to be fundamental to not burn out?
Yes. Well, hey, Audra, I see that question. What a great question for a gerontologist to be asking. So how can we be a catalyst? You know, I think that's through story, right? And, you know, it's one of the things that we frequently, you know, ask people. I mean, it's like a key networking question, right? So what brought you to this business? And then say, no, really, what brought you to this business? You know, I think it's one of the things that, you know, I've learned from both Jay and Gigi about, you know, so, you know, tell me more about that. Or, you know, the 5 whys. So really, why? Because people will tell you. And through those stories, you will be able to hear that purpose and then work together to think about that. You know, and I think just as Eric was saying about the work that they do with InnovAge, you know, it's so individual. Hi, Ashley. I just saw you. Yes, go gerontology. Another gerontologist on the presentation today. Yeah, that's a great question, Audra. Thank you.
Does anybody else have a question? We can do maybe one more because it is after 12. If anybody else has another question or comment they'd like to share. Miss Lolly.
Yes, I was going to ask, under the measures to overcome compassion fatigue, it said professional development. How do we convince people that going on a webinar is going to be just as effective as, you know, the way they used to go to like a seminar down the road and get lunch provided? And, you know, people are used to the way they used to learn. Does that make sense?
Yeah, hang on. I think she froze. So hang on a second. And you froze. And
well, Micah, you answer.
I'm not going to answer that with any connotation at all.
Well, I can hop in if you need.
Go ahead, Jay. Go ahead, Jay.
Yeah.
Could you rephrase that just one more time, please? The question, Lolly.
Under measures to overcome compassion fatigue, it said professional development, which I do, you know, believe in that. But to convince our cohorts that going on a webinar such as this for an hour is going to be just as effective as when they used to go to a seminar for 3 hours and get lunch provided.
And thank you for asking that question. We had this conversation last evening at the Long Life Roundtable when we were talking about developing resilience. And the participants in this conversation were talking about online versus in person and how actually the skills that it's taken to adapt to this online form of learning are actually showcasing a type of resilience. So the fact that we can adapt to and still glean materials from this online, these conversations like Mike is having and the more intimate conversations in the Long Life Roundtable are really contributing toward resilience. So just because we were used to it one way in person doesn't mean that we can't adapt to and learn from and rise to the occasion from learning online, because that's the essence of resilience, is pivoting or adaptability.
Mhm. I'm finding the young people aren't pivoting over to this. I don't know. Some of our younger employees.
Well, young people will hopefully eventually be older people, and many folks on this call will agree that life experience, wisdom comes with longevity. So we just have to share that, you'll have to trust us. We've been here, and when you pivot and adapt, you're building your resilience callus.
Mm-hmm.
Hey Jay, since I don't know if Ann's coming back on, but somebody typed in one more question, then we will have to close. Is there something that can be done when you can see that a person needs help but is refusing help?
Watch. We talk about in gerontology all the time the issue of paternalism. You should be doing this. You should accept my help. Well, sometimes, and somebody mentioned this before, when you impose your own values and principles on somebody else, you're shoulding all over the place. We all, no, I can't say that. Most of us value our autonomy. So all I can say is that when somebody says they don't want your help, take their word for it. But it's okay to sit back and watch and look for an opportunity to assist if the issues proceed.
True. Thank you, Jay, for finishing this up. Unfortunately, Ann is probably not able to get back on to finish this up. But Jay, thank you for being here and assisting with that. I don't know what happened there. It's Zoom. What can you do? So I'm going to stop recording now.